Good morning, everyone. Today is Wednesday, March 24th. Bill Toomey is going to do his third installment of stories referencing the Grafton Inn, guests, and particularly today, he's going to feature the Phelps Barn. So he has a couple of stories to discuss and then talk about some different distinguished guests that have joined us over the years. So I'd like to welcome Bill this morning to our third series.
Thank you, Angela. It's such a great pleasure to be here at the Grafton Inn again, having spent 30 years of my life working here. I still walk in the door of the inn and I feel a particular sense of joy and pleasure in being here. And especially this year, since the inn is celebrating its 220th birthday. And what an occasion that is. I mean, there are so few inns in the United States that can boast of still serving the public in their original building on their original site after more than 200 years. Extraordinary. As you can guess, down the 30 years that I was working here, I had many curious encounters, circumstances or people that I met with that were extraordinary in some way or another. And it is, I'm going to present to you this morning a few of those occasions, and they are not fully developed stories. Some are just moments that occurred that were delightful. Some are a little more developed, but don't consider them full-blown stories in themselves. If you find your own name emerging in one of these stories, please forgive me. I've tried to change the names to protect the innocent or the guilty, but you never know. Sometimes a fragment of truth will creep in. At any rate, I'm going to begin with a story that concerns a musician who was playing right here in the barn where I'm seated now. I will end with a story of another musician doing exactly the same thing, and both are truly extraordinary stories. The first story concerns a man who has played at the inn many, many times down the years. He is a favorite of guests and people throughout the area, actually, who will come to hear him. His name is John Specker, and he is a fiddler. Plays country fiddle, sings to the fiddle, as well as plays in a most extraordinary style, a very unique style that he developed himself, harmonizing all the melodies he plays as he creates double stops and triple stops on the fiddle, and at the same time singing remarkably well to the instrument. Not only that, he sits on a resonating box to which he creates percussion with his feet by stamping on the box as he plays. And John is truly a musical phenomenon. And as I said, he's played here many times down the years, both offering Saturday night entertainment in the barn, or actually from time to time presenting a full-blown concert where people come not after dinner to sit and be entertained, but who come on Sunday afternoon or whatnot to enjoy a formal concert. But the occasion I'm thinking of concerned a wonderful guest that came here for many years, and I don't think she's coming anymore, and nor do I know whether she and her husband are still whinnying with us, but I certainly hope so, because Mrs. Dixon was an extraordinary and broadly based woman, broadly based in the sense of being cultivated, cultured, educated, and thoughtful. Mrs. Dixon, incidentally, donated to the library here at the inn the complete works of Charles Dickens from her own library. It was a much-loved, leather-bound set of books, and they are still there for the pleasure of guests that want to indulge in a little Dickens while they're here at the inn. But it happened that John was playing not a full-blown concert here at the inn, but entertainment in the barn one Saturday evening. And I was passing through the lobby area, and I looked over and saw Mrs. Dixon sitting there reading the paper, as she often did after dinner. And I just stopped by, I said, "Good evening, Mrs. Dixon." And she returned my greetings, and I said, I just wanted to let you know that there is live music happening in the barn, Mrs. Dixon." And she looked at me, she said, "Oh, Bill," she said, "you mean the fiddler?" And I said, "Well, yes, the fiddler." "Well, you know, Bill," she said, "I'm really more of a Mozart and Beethoven kind of person." And I said, "Well, I was pretty sure of that, Mrs. Dixon." I said, "But if I'm not mistaken, you're also a person with a remarkable sense of curiosity." And I said, "If you poke your head in the barn for just a couple of minutes," I said, "you will hear something so extraordinary, so unusual, that I'm sure you will be able to tell me you've never heard anything like it, and I think it will delight you." She thanked me. I passed on the way and thought, well, so she's not going to stop out. About an hour later, I came down to the barn to present John with his check as he finished up. And I stepped into the back of the barn by the bar, which was then serving as the bar in the downstairs of the barn. And from there, I could see the whole floor and see John up in front where he was performing. And sure enough, I saw Mrs. Dixon seated in a chair up there. Well, I was delighted. And she'd obviously been there for a little while. And John played maybe 1-2 more tunes and then wrapped up his presentation. And as he finished his last tune with a flourish, Mrs. Dixon jumped to her feet and she said, "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, "that man is a genius." And I clapped along with everybody else, and I was delighted. Mrs. Dixon laughed, and I was so pleased that she was so broad-minded as to come out and try something that was so foreign to her musically. Well, of course, that incident is always stuck in my mind. And it was about a year or two later that I presented John in a formal concert here at the inn. And so we advertised in the paper for that specific event. And I wrote up a little encapsulation of the incident I've just described to you to use in my advertising. I said something to the effect of, "One self-described Mozart and Beethoven person declared that John Specker was a genius." Well, about 3 or 4 days after the advertising appeared in the paper, the telephone rang. It was a call from me. I picked up the phone. She said, "Bill, it's Mrs. Dixon over here in Manchester." She said, "And I believe you owe me a concert ticket. You've used me in your advertising." And I said, "You're absolutely right, Mrs. Dixon. I not only owe you a ticket, I owe you a cocktail." And I said, "If you'd be good enough to stop over and hear the concert, you'll get both." Well, Mrs. Dixon didn't stop over and hear the concert. And in fact, although I think I spoke to her once later on the telephone, it was the last time I saw Mrs. Dixon, was the evening she saw John Specker perform. But I have always remembered her with great fondness and taken inspiration from her broad-minded attitude towards life and her curiosity about things that she did not already know. Now, the next story I'm going to tell you concerns 2 remarkable guests at the inn. Neither one of them is still alive, sadly, but both lived very rich lives, and lives that were as different as their physical characters were. The first person in this story is a man named Christian Ganghoff, whom we all called Chris at his insistence. And Chris was a relatively short guy. I don't believe he couldn't have been over 5 foot 5 inches tall. He was very thin, bespectacled, meticulous in his attire, and totally fastidious in his behavior. In fact, rather compulsive in his behavior. Chris lived by the clock, and he lived by his customs, what he was used to doing. He always had his cocktail at the same time every day. When he came into the barn to have his cocktail, he always sat in the same chair. And he got here 15 minutes before the bar opened to be sure he got his chair. In fact, After several years of encountering guests that came at the same time to the inn as he did, these guests one year came with a little brass plaque that they screwed to the back of Chris's chair. And the plaque said, "This chair belongs to Christian Ganghoff." And Chris always came in to dinner at the same time. He sat at the same table, in the same chair. And interestingly enough, there were two things that had to be on the menu when Chris came to visit us. One was orange marmalade for breakfast, had to have it. The other was tapioca pudding for dessert in the evening. Otherwise, we never had tapioca on the menu. But that's what it was like with Chris about. And he always stayed in the same room in the inn, as you can imagine. His job in life was he was an attorney, an estates attorney. He worked on crossing the T's and dotting the I's and making sure everyone's will was in place and the execution of a will was exactly according to the wishes of the deceased. I mean, he was a man who basically lived in his office. He, I would say, lived a sheltered life, and he was very quiet, very unassuming, very intelligent man. If you engaged him in conversation, very pleasant, but otherwise kept pretty much to himself. Now, the second character involved in this story visited the inn every year, just as Chris did for many years, but their visits never overlapped until this particular time, which I'm going to tell you about. And the second guest was a man named Harry Downey. And in every way, he was the exact opposite of Christian Ganghoff. Harry was about 6'5" tall, very tall man, craggy, bony, big skeleton. You know, he had huge hands and he had a deep baritone voice, and he was about as friendly a soul as you could ever want to encounter. If Harry Downey went into dinner, I can promise you by the time he came out from dinner, he was probably on a first name basis with almost everybody in the dining room. I mean, he was just an amazing guy. His work in life was he worked for businesses, promoting them at openings and whatnot like that. He would go around. He was someone who glad-handed people. He loved to be with people. Couldn't wait to engage with folks. And Harry would always come here with horses. He trailered in horses with his very dear partner, Nan Feeder, and they would stay for a week and do a lot of riding in the area over the back roads here. And of course, the inn has a barn across the way with beautiful stables in it for people that do want to bring horses. I'm not sure whether that is still available for folks or not. I haven't been in touch in recent years. I haven't seen many horsemen here in Grafton in recent times. But at any rate, Harry came every year. And in this particular year, his visit overlapped with Chris's. Now, Chris, among his many habits, had one that was when he finished dinner, he would come out to the lobby and he would read the newspaper for an hour or so. Then at 9:15, he would get up and approach the front desk and he would announce to the desk clerk that he was retiring for the night. And she'd wish him, or he'd wish Chris a good night, and off he would go. But that was his habit, did it every single night. Well, this one night he'd been in the lobby reading the paper. He came to the front desk to announce his retirement for the evening. And just as he approached the front desk, Harry Downey was coming out from dinner. Well, Harry walks up and he looks down at Chris and he says, "Well there, young fella." He said, "I don't think we've ever met before." He said, "Do you come here often?" Chris said, "Well, yes." He said, I've been coming here for more than 40 years. "Oh, my Lord," said Harry. And he says, "You look so young." He said, "My name's Harry Downey. What's yours?" He said, "My name is Christian Ganghoff." "Well, Christian," says Harry, "what do you do for a living?" Chris said, "Well, I'm a lawyer." "Oh, my God, said Harry, and his huge hand comes thundering down on the front desk. He says, another one of you blood-sucking sons of guns. He says, I want to ask you something, Christian. He says, hasn't your conscience ever bothered you? And Chris looked like he was totally in shock. And he looked up at Harry and he adjusted his glasses and he said, well, he said, it did bother me once when I thought I had undercharged a client. And Harry looked at him for a minute and he burst out with this thunder of laughter, clapped Chris on the back, and Chris sort of laughed himself. He couldn't believe it. He told a joke. And Harry just, they bonded together and they were walking all over town the next day together. And it looked like a pairing of, like Arnold Schwarzenegger and Danny DeVito. I mean, this huge, tall, bony guy and this little thin fella. I mean, it was just amazing to watch them. And they became very good friends after that. I'm not sure that they ever shared a visit again. I don't remember that. But the wonderful thing was, it was the moment at which Chris discovered that he was a funny guy. He could tell a joke. And so ever after, and Chris visited the inn for many years after that, every time he came to the inn, he would have a joke to tell. He told that joke to everybody, to the desk clerk, to the waitress, to the bus person, to other guests. I've heard him tell that joke as many as 5 times during his stay, depending upon what setting he was in. And I do remember the last joke that Chris told us when he made his last stay at the inn. It wasn't presumed to be his last stay, but Chris was in his 90s by then and still driving to the inn. And I'll tell you Chris's joke, hoping that none of you have heard it, because it's really quite a good one. And Chris told it well. He was well practiced joke telling by this time. He said, every year I drive up here from Bronxville, New York. He said, it's rather a long trip for me. He said, I'm in the habit of stopping at about the halfway point. And he said, there is a monastery that I stop at that has a wonderful bakery. He said, and I love to stop there in their bakery and I get a cup of coffee and a beautiful croissant. He said, they make the most beautiful croissant, he said, and it just refreshes me completely. I love it. I do it, done it for year after year after year. He said, this year I was driving up. He said, I was so shocked. He said, the restaurant had been converted into a fish and chips joint. He said it was still run by the monastery. He said, but why they did that? He said, I was so disheartened when I saw it. But I was in the habit of stopping. And he said, I'll stop. And if I have to, I'll eat a plate of fish and chips. So he said, I parked the car and I walked in the door. I looked over and I saw this fella. And he said, hello. He said, are you the fish fryer? The fellow looked back at him and he said, nope, I'm the chipmunk. That was Chris's last joke. Hope you enjoyed it. The next story I'm going to tell you is one of particular delight now that it's over. One of those incidents that you go through in life where it's pretty horrible when you're going through the circumstances you are, but when you reflect on it with the passage of time, you just shake your head and smile and think, God, wasn't that extraordinary? Well, it concerns, again, 2 characters who stayed at the inn. Well, were not guests at the inn. One was just a diner, someone who came to dine at the inn. The other was a guest who stayed here. The guest who stayed here was a delightful woman, always came on her own. Her name was Mrs. Holmes. And she came for many years. I can't say that there was anything that distinguished her completely, except for the fact that she came alone and always stayed for 3 or 4 days and then would be gone and back the next year. And she didn't seem to want to reach out to people. I mean, she was perfectly courteous if you spoke to her, but she was really here, it seemed, for a time of quiet reflection. The other person I'll describe to you in a moment. There came a night, it wasn't terribly busy, during one of Mrs. Holmes' visits. And I got a call from the front desk and they said they need you in the barn. And when moments of particular business would come, I would instructed everyone when they got swamped to call me. If it was in the dining room, I would rush in and bus tables and reset tables. If it was at the front desk, I would go and talk to people, show them to their rooms or whatever was needed. In the bar, run out there and make drinks to help the bartender out if he or she got swamped. But it was Fred Way that had called me from the barn. And when I came in the back door by the bar, I slipped into the bar and said, "What's up, Fred?" He didn't seem to have any particular business. He said, "Boy," he said, "I thought you ought to be aware of the people that have just come in. Check that out." So I looked out from the bar, and here was this crowd of, it was actually 6 people that had gathered in the barn, all men. And I will tell you, they were the roughest looking bunch of monkeys I had ever seen come into this place. I mean, these guys were filthy. There's no other way to describe it. Dressed in work clothes, but it looked like they just came out of the grease pit. And I mean, unkempt, and one had to presume pretty uncouth. That proved to be true. And I thought, oh my God, I hope they were stopping for just a quick drink or something. There was nobody else really in the barn to be disturbed by them. And anyway, their boss, I guess, came back to the bar, and he walked up to the bar, and without any introduction at all, he leaned over and he says, "You got cognac?" And I said, "Well, yes, sir, we have cognac." And he said, "I don't mean what them other places serve." He says, "I mean the real stuff." And he used a few expletives in there to emphasize his point. And I said, "Well, sir, the only cognac I have," I said, is the best in Vermont. And I said, "We're the only bar in Vermont that serves it." And I said, "It's been aged for 25 years in the wood. If you'd like to try a little sip," I poured him a little sip and gave it to him. And he drank that down. He said, "Give me that." He said, "Beer for everybody else, Budweiser." So I poured him that drink, and Fred got a beer for everyone else, and they settled down at the table. It seemed like things were under control. There didn't seem to be anyone else that was upset. And just out of curiosity, I went to the front desk to ask if anybody knew who the heck that was in the barn. We'd never seen them before. Well, they said, "Is it a party of 6?" I said, "Yes, it is." They said, "Well, they're coming in to dinner." I said, "What?" I looked down and the name was there on the reservation sheet. Pitts was the name. Pitts. Well, it was Mr. Pitts. I presumed he was the man who was drinking the cognac. Well, I went out to the bar to check with Fred. By then, Mr. Pitts had consumed another 2 cognacs. I ran into the dining room and got a hold of Joanne, who's our head waitress, still is our head waitress, now pushing on to 41 years of service at the inn. Incredible woman. And I said, "Joanne," I said, "you have the most unlikely party of 6 that are coming into dinner." And I say, "It's a quiet night. Just try to give them excellent service." I say, "You always do, but be particularly fastidious with them. See that all their needs are met, because these guys," I said, "if they get out of hand, I mean, they can start breaking up the furniture. I mean, they might start breaking me up. I mean, whatever." At any rate, Joanne assured me that they would get excellent service, and she'd get a bus person on it right away, and she'd be there herself. Fine. So finally, Mr. Pitts went on into dinner. Well, she took their orders, got another round of drinks for everybody. That was Mr. Pitts's 5th cognac. Served appetizers to everyone and stood back. And conversation such as it was, they were pretty quiet once they started eating. Conversation such as it was minimal, and Joanne waited, and the minute she saw they were pretty well finished, she went over to Mr. Pitts, and she reached down to take his appetizer plate. "Don't you touch that plate," he yelled. "Don't you touch that plate, I ain't done yet." God, she jumped back, and Mrs. Holmes, who was seated at a neighboring table, was absolutely shocked. She was startled. She was at first startled by seeing this crew enter the dining room, and now she was, I would say, terrified. Joanne stepped back and she gave the bus person the nod, and the bus person went over and said, "If you're done with your appetizers, I can take those plates away and bring you your dinners." And they all looked at one another and gave their assent. And so then they began clearing the appetizer plates, and no further incident. Well, Mrs. Holmes got up and hurried past them out of the dining room. She went to the front desk and said, "I will be checking out in the morning." She went to her room, and the next morning she came in and checked out. She had 2 more days left to stay at the inn, so she left early. Didn't say anything, but that week we got a letter from her, and she described in great detail the horror of her experience, how she never dreamed that the inn would accommodate people like that, and that she would never come back to the inn and stay again. Well, of course, it was my job to pen a reply to her. Profuse apologies, of course, honoring her years of patronage. And I explained to her the situation and our great fear that by trying to expel this crew from the inn, we would provide a far worse experience than if we just saw it through and got them out without incident, because otherwise it could have resulted in violence. And I excused ourselves again and said, "I'm sure that these people will never come back to the inn," because of course the bill they ran up was horrendous. It was huge. And I promised Mrs. Holmes that if she would come back to the inn, we would be delighted to see her and would grant her an all expense paid weekend at the inn and our profuse apologies. Sent the letter off. Well, I should mention, having mentioned the expense of Greg Pitt's dinner at the inn, his name was, I ultimately learned his first name was Greg Pitts. And when he was finished dinner, I mean, the bill came to very close to $500. I mean, with all the drinks they had and the bar, you know, I mean, cognac isn't cheap. And Greg Pitts reached right into his pocket and he pulled out a wad of bills that was huge, counted it right off, left a big tip for the waitress, and then walked right into the kitchen. Walked around, 20 for the dishwasher, 20 for the chef, 20 for the bus person, 20 for the pots and pans man. I mean, he was like a walking bankroll. It was astounding. Then he went out and got his crew and left, and we didn't see him again. We did not expect that Mrs. Holmes would return to the inn. But after perhaps it was 4 or 5 years, I saw Mrs. Holmes' name on the list of arrivals for the afternoon, arrivals for that evening. And I thought, can it be our Mrs. Holmes? And surely it was. In she came. And I greeted her at the door very warmly. I said, I hope that the passing years had assuaged somewhat the trauma that she had experienced the last time she was here, and we were delighted to see her again, and so forth and so forth. She came, everything was fine. She went into dinner, and she sat in the very chair that Christian Ganghawk used to occupy as you faced into the dining room. It was the chair at the table at the far left corner of the formal dining room. So she had a perfect view of the entryway to the dining room. And she had gone into dinner and was there for probably half an hour. I was at the front desk doing something, and the front door opened. And you can guess who walked in the front door. None other than Greg Pitts, whom we had not seen since his first visit. He was with his substantial wife, and he announced they were there to celebrate their wedding anniversary and to have some of that cognac. I couldn't believe it. My heart sank. I got him at the front desk. I said, if you'll just wait here in the lobby, Mr. Pitts, I said, I'll see you get the best seat in the dining room. And I was just praying that around the Johnson alcove, in a table hidden from view from the table at which Mrs. Holmes was seated, that would be free. I got in, it was free. I quickly reset it from a 4-top to a 2-top, both chairs facing away from the dining room. Went and got Joanne, explained the situation to her. I said, you won't believe it. Greg Pitts is back. And here is Mrs. Holmes. I said, I've got to bring him into the dining room. Can you go over and talk to Mrs. Holmes and position yourself so that you obstruct her view of the entryway? She said, I'll do my best. So Joanne went over and began to distract Mrs. Holmes with some light conversation. I hurried out, got Mr. Pitts and his wife, brought them up to the dining room, led them around the corner, hoping I didn't hear a shriek or a scream as I did so, got them seated, and immediately brought them half a bottle of champagne to start off the evening of their celebration, quiet celebration, I hoped, which indeed it was. And Mrs. Holmes finished her dinner and left the dining room, never realizing that her nemesis had been seated there with her. Now, that was the last we saw of Mrs. Holmes after that visit. I'm not sure why she never came back, but she never did. And Mr. Pitts never re-entered the inn either. I did have one brief encounter with Mr. Pitts when a car that I had been driving basically hit. I drove it right into the ground. It was basically worthless. It still ran, but it was nothing you could trade in. And I called in the phone book a business in Grafton I'd never seen before called Grafton Auto Salvage. And it was at the top of Fisher Hill Road in Grafton. And this man answered the phone, and I recognized his voice immediately. It was Greg Pitts. Said, I got a car down here. I said, still runs, but it's no good for trade-in. Wondered if you'd be interested in it, if you'd come and pick it up. Yep, he said, I'll pick it up, $100. So, oh my God, he wants to charge me $100 for it, to take the car away? I said, all right, Mr. Pitts, I'll see you in a little while. Came right up to the house, looked at the car, said, yep, $100. I was about to go in to get my checkbook and pay him when he pulled a checkbook out of his pocket, pulled it out, wrote out a check, which said on the check, literally, $100. $100. Signed it. That was it. He paid me $100 for the junk, put it on his record, and took it away. That was the last I saw of Greg Pitts. Since he has left town, and where he is now, I have no idea, but I wish him well, as I do Mrs. Holmes. Now, the last story I'd like to tell you, as I mentioned at the start, concerns another musician who, down the years, played many, many times at the inn, both for evening entertainment on Saturday nights and to present full-blown concerts. As with John Specker, he is a brilliant musician. I consider him a phenomenon. He is not only brilliant in his music, but he is a brilliant entertainer who loves to play for people, loves people, communicates that to them, not only through his music, but through his personality. His name is Alcibiades Stereopoulos. You guessed it, he's a Greek, of Greek descent. First generation. Everybody calls Alcibiades Alki. If you want to see this brilliant man, I think you can go to your computer and just Google Alki, and I think it will come up. Or I think his website is actually called I Am Alki. So if you're curious, check him out. But Alki is a pianist and he sings, but it's the piano that is his special forte. And he has a musical memory that leaves me aghast, astonished. Everything from World War I tunes right up to rock and roll through the 60s and 70s. I've never heard him do anything that approached rapping or hip hop or anything like that. But certainly Broadway, opera, I mean, he can take anything. And he not only knows the tunes, but his ability to spontaneously create fabulous music over these tunes is absolutely amazing to me. And of all the tunes he ever played for me, the one that moved me most was one I ultimately begged him every time he played it at the end. I said, please make it your sign-off number, your signature closing number. And it was the tango tune, La Paloma, which means the dove in Spanish. And if you heard this tune, I'm sure you would recognize it. It's probably the most famous of all tango tunes. But Alki can take that tune and my God, he can just work magic with it, moving it from key to key seamlessly, transforming it in its rhythms and in its nature. You're always hearing the tune, but morphing it like something made of plastic, molding it into the most marvelous imaginative creations that you could possibly think of. Now, Alki was the one musician that came here that never lived by the clock. If I hired him to play from 8 to 10, didn't matter when 10 o'clock arrived. If there was 10 people left in the barn or one person left in the barn that was listening to the music, Alki would keep playing. And the one night I'm thinking of here, there was a barn full of people throughout most of the night. Bit by bit, as Alki played, they would get up and they would thank Alki for a wonderful evening, and they were off to bed. Alki would play some tune for them they might request as their parting tune. But ultimately, right up in front of him, there was just one couple left. And they were what I considered then, not now, of course, to be somewhat elderly, probably in their mid to late 80s. And they had been there throughout the entire evening, applauding vigorously, loving his tunes, occasionally requesting tunes, which Alki was happy to provide. And finally, it came time. I was back at the bar, and I was waving this check at him, saying, Alki, let's wrap this up, because I, for one, want to get home before midnight. And Alki finally saw me back there, brought whatever tune he was playing to an end, and then he sat there for a moment quietly, studying the keyboard, letting the silence gather. Then he reached up and began. Dum, da-dum, dum, dum, da-dum, dum, ba-da, ba-dum, bum-bee. And away went the tango tune. Alki on this incredible journey. And the couple sat there for a couple of minutes. They looked at one another, and the gentleman finally pushed his chair back, and I thought, oh, they realize it's the closing tune. They're getting ready to leave. They've had enough. And the gentleman got up and he reached out into his hand to help his wife up from her chair, and she got up. And they embraced, and they began to dance. The most exquisite tango, so subtle, so simple, and yet executed in a way that only years and years and years of practice could have brought to them. It was so beautiful to see, all alone there with Alki. And when he finished the tune and wrapped it up, he ended with the suggestion of the deep bow, and she with her leg extended And then they kissed one another and went over and thanked Alki. And Alki got up and embraced them both. And it was just the most touching, beautiful moment that I could ever hope to imagine. And it seems like a fitting moment to leave you for this one session and to thank you all for having been here. And perhaps we'll do this again sometime. My thanks again to Angela, Innkeeper Angela Comstock, and all of her wonderful staff that worked so hard to maintain the incredible history of this inn. And may it survive long past my years. And wishing you all farewell. Perhaps we'll meet again. Thank you so much.